Mansions were not built because the rich had too much money. They were built because money had nowhere safe to go. This claim runs directly against the way we are taught to understand wealth. We tend to assume that large fortunes naturally seek liquidity, that cash is freedom, and that the ability to move capital quickly is the ultimate form of control. From this perspective, grand estates look irrational, expensive, inflexible, and unnecessarily burdensome. Yet for long stretches of economic history, the opposite was true. Liquidity was the problem. Immobility was the solution. The contradiction begins with scale. When wealth reaches a certain size, it stops behaving like ordinary money. Small amounts of cash can sit quietly in banks, be reinvested casually, or be held without consequence. Large concentrations of cash cannot. They distort the systems that hold them. They attract attention, amplify risk, and expose their owners to forces they do not command. For the richest families of the industrial age, the question was not how to make money liquid, but how to prevent liquidity from becoming dangerous. This reframes the mansion not as a lifestyle choice, but as an economic response. At the moment these estates were built, financial systems were young, fragmented, and fragile. Banks failed regularly. Markets were volatile and thin. Legal frameworks for trusts, inheritance, and large-scale asset protection were inconsistent and politically unstable. Money moved faster than the institutions designed to manage it. In that environment, holding large amounts of cash meant constant exposure to collapse, confiscation, or sudden loss of value. The central tension was simple but severe. Wealth needed protection, but protection required commitment. Cash promised flexibility, yet demanded trust in systems that had not earned it. Every decision to remain liquid forced families to engage with markets, intermediaries, and political structures beyond their control. Wealth became restless. It required attention, reaction, and constant judgment. For families whose primary objective was continuity, rather than growth, this was exhausting and risky. The mansion emerged as a way to resolve this tension by transforming money into something slower and harder to dislodge. Land absorbed capital without requiring daily validation. Buildings anchored wealth to geography and law rather than sentiment. Estates created systems that could function internally, partially insulated from national and international shocks. What looked like excess from the outside was, from the inside, a form of restraint. The mansion was not where wealth was spent. It was where wealth was put to rest. This is where modern interpretations often fail. We see scale and assume display. We see permanence and assume confidence. But the size of these estates reflected not exuberance, but limitation. Money had outgrown the containers available to it. The mansion was a container of last resort, one that traded liquidity for stability, speed for endurance. It solved a problem that no longer feels intuitive because the conditions that created it have largely disappeared. The contradiction deepens when we consider what was sacrificed. By embedding money into land and estate systems, families gave up flexibility. Capital could not be redeployed easily. Adjustments took time. Exiting the system required dismantling it. Yet this sacrifice was intentional. Illiquidity imposed discipline. It prevented impulsive decisions and reduced exposure to short-term volatility. In a world defined by frequent financial shocks, this rigidity felt protective rather than restrictive. At the heart of this story is a misunderstanding about motivation. Mansions were not built to announce wealth to society. They were built to hide wealth from instability. They were defensive structures, not celebratory ones. The central contradiction is that the most visible symbols of wealth were responses to the invisibility of safe financial options. Money had nowhere else to go, so it became land, buildings, and systems that could stand still when everything else moved too fast. Understanding this changes how we interpret both the architecture and the economics of old wealth. It's worth pausing here before moving forward. The decision to pour money into mansions and estates was not driven by taste. It was driven by incentives created by an unstable financial environment. When we reconstruct the economic logic of the period, the behavior of wealthy families appears less eccentric and far more systematic. Mansions made sense because the alternatives were worse. Industrial wealth arrived unevenly and unpredictably. Profits surged during booms and vanished during panics. Banking systems were undercapitalized, poorly regulated, and regionally fragmented. A single institutional failure could freeze access to deposits or erase them entirely. For families whose fortunes exceeded the scale of any single bank, diversification across institutions did not eliminate risk. It multiplied exposure. Each additional intermediary was another point of failure. Markets offered no reliable refuge. Capital markets were shallow relative to the size of emerging fortunes. Large positions distorted prices, and exit was rarely clean. Selling assets often meant signaling distress, triggering price collapses that punished the very act of trying to reduce risk. Liquidity, in practice, was conditional. It existed only until it was needed most. Political risk further complicated the picture. Concentrated cash was legible. It could be identified, assessed, and targeted. As governments expanded their fiscal reach, liquid wealth became an obvious source of revenue. Taxation, forced loans, and ad hoc regulations disproportionately affected those whose wealth could be easily measured. Illiquid assets, by contrast, were slower to assess and harder to seize without legal and social resistance. This difference mattered enormously to families seeking long-term security. Within this context, land emerged as a rational repository for surplus capital. Land did not depend on institutional promises. Its value fluctuated, but it did not vanish overnight. It was governed by local law, embedded in social relations, and often politically protected. Ownership created leverage, not just financially but socially. Estates anchored families to regions, workforces, and production systems that reinforced their legitimacy and bargaining power. The mansion served as the organizational center of this strategy. It justified the concentration of land and the coordination of economic activity. Large estates integrated agriculture, forestry, housing, and local commerce into a single system. These activities generated modest but reliable cash flows that were decoupled from national financial cycles. The goal was not high return, but low variance. Stability was the metric of success. Tax structures often reinforced this logic. Property and inheritance laws frequently favored long-term landholding over liquid capital. Estates could be passed down, restructured, and protected through legal mechanisms that were unavailable or untested for financial assets. Over time, wealth embedded in land became quieter. It attracted less scrutiny and required fewer defensive maneuvers. What tied these incentives together was the relative scarcity of trustworthy containers for capital. Money does not exist in a vacuum. It requires systems to hold it. When those systems are weak, wealth seeks alternatives. Mansions and estates were not chosen because they were optimal in absolute terms, but because they were the least unstable option available. This logic also explains the scale of these projects. Small estates did not solve the problem. Only large, integrated systems could absorb enough capital to matter. Scale created internal diversification. If one activity underperformed, others compensated. The estate became a portfolio expressed in land rather than paper. It was slow, but it was resilient. From his perspective, the mansion economy was not a deviation from rational behavior. It was an adaptation to scarcity, not of money, but of institutional trust. The rich did not flee cash out of superstition. They fled because the structures meant to protect it were insufficient for the scale of their fortunes. This is the part of the story that only becomes visible when we stop judging outcomes and start examining incentives. It's worth holding on to this logic before looking at how the system actually functioned. Once money was embedded into land and estates, it entered a system designed to quiet Its restlessness. Cash was no longer expected to sit idle or move opportunistically. Instead, it was transformed into structure. The mansion economy worked by converting financial surplus into a slow, internally regulated process that reduced dependence on external systems. The first step was absorption. Large inflows of cash from industry, finance, or trade were redirected away from markets and into physical assets. Land purchases, construction, infrastructure, and long-term improvements acted as financial sinks. Capital disappeared from circulation and reappeared as fields, forests, buildings, and roads. This was not a one-time act, but an ongoing strategy. As long as surplus existed, it was pulled inward and fixed in place. Once inside the estate, money no longer behaved like capital seeking return. It behaved like energy maintaining equilibrium. Revenue streams were diversified across activities that responded differently to external conditions. Agricultural output, rents, timber, and local services produced steady inflows that were rarely spectacular but rarely catastrophic. These revenues were designed to cover costs, not to compound aggressively. Expenditures were structured to reinforce the system rather than extract from it. Labor was central. Estates employed large numbers of workers whose wages circulated locally. Housing, food, and services provided by the estate captured a portion of that spending, returning money back into the system. This internal circulation reduced leakage and dampened volatility. The estate became a semi-closed economy, less sensitive to price swings elsewhere. Management replaced speculation as the core of financial activity. Accountants and stewards monitored flows over seasons and years rather than days and weeks. Decisions prioritized balance and continuity. Maintenance was treated as investment. Infrastructure upgrades were justified by durability rather than efficiency. The estate was expected to persist, not to outperform alternatives. Illiquidity was not an accident. It was enforced deliberately. Assets were difficult to sell quickly, and that difficulty imposed discipline. Capital could not be redeployed impulsively in response to market noise. This constraint protected families from their own reactions as much as from external shocks. The system was designed to remove choice at moments when choice was dangerous. Risk did not disappear. It was redistributed. Exposure shifted away from financial markets and toward environmental conditions, labor relations, and political stability. These risks unfolded slowly and locally. They could be managed through administration rather than timing. For families seeking generational continuity, this was preferable. The estate turned uncertainty into something observable and gradual. The mansion itself functioned as the administrative and symbolic center of this arrangement. It housed records, authority, and coordination. It made the system legible internally, even as it became opaque externally. Wealth no longer needed to be explained or defended constantly. It was embedded in a visible structure that justified its own existence through function. What sustained this system was not high productivity, but alignment. As long as revenues covered costs and the social environment remained supportive, the estate could endure with minimal adjustment. Money stopped asking where it should go next. It had arrived somewhere permanent. This internal logic explains why the mansion economy felt stable for so long. It replaced exposure with process. It traded adaptability for predictability. And it worked, not because it was efficient, but because it reduced the number of things that could go wrong at once. Curiosity is the right response to this machinery. It's worth holding this image of quiet circulation before examining what eventually disrupted it. The mansion economy did not fail because it was poorly designed. It failed because the environment that made it rational gradually disappeared. What had once been a solution to institutional weakness became a constraint in a world where those institutions matured. The system was built to neutralize volatility, not to adapt to acceleration, and this mismatch became increasingly costly. The first source of stress came from financial stabilization. Banking systems improved. Central institutions learned how to prevent cascading failures. Capital markets deepened, allowing large sums to move without immediate distortion. Instruments emerged that could absorb scale, diversify exposure, and manage risk without immobilizing wealth. Cash, once dangerous, became manageable. In comparison, estates began to look inefficient. Capital locked in a land could not respond quickly to new opportunities, and the opportunity cost of immobility grew steadily. At the same time, the internal economics of estates deteriorated. Labor markets changed as industrial and urban employment expanded. Workers were no longer dependent on estates for survival. Wages rose, mobility increased, and long-standing social arrangements weakened. The internal circulation of money slowed as labor became less captive and more external. Costs increased without proportional gains in productivity, eroding the delicate balance that sustained the system. Taxation introduced another structural weakness. Modern states required predictable revenue, and land was visible, accessible, and difficult to hide. Recurring property taxes and inheritance duties transformed illiquidity from protection into burden. Estates required cash to survive, yet their structure resisted generating it quickly. This mismatch forced incremental asset sales, each one reducing the system's coherence and increasing future vulnerability. Cultural and political legitimacy also eroded. Estates had once justified their scale by providing employment, production, and local stability. As economies centralized and specialized, that justification weakened. Large estates came to be seen as inefficient repositories of capital rather than productive systems. Public tolerance declined. What had been perceived as stewardship increasingly appeared as obstruction. This mattered because the mansion economy relied on alignment between private wealth and public acceptance. Most critically, the system lacked flexibility. Estates were designed for continuity, not transformation. When agricultural markets globalized, transportation reshaped demand, and financial returns elsewhere accelerated, the mansion economy could not respond without dismantling itself. Each adaptation required breaking the internal interdependence that made the system viable. The more integrated the estate, the harder it was to change. The breakdown was, therefore, gradual and uneven. Maintenance was deferred. Portions of land were sold. Revenue streams shrank. The estate persisted outwardly while hollowing out internally. Illiquidity, once a shield, became a trap. Cash was needed to survive, yet the system was built to avoid producing it at scale. There was no dramatic collapse, no singular error. The mansion economy ended because its assumptions no longer matched reality. Stability ceased to be scarce. Flexibility became essential. A system designed to stand still in a volatile world could not compete in a world that rewarded constant movement. This was not decline as punishment, but as transition. Wealth did not vanish. It migrated to forms better suited to a faster, more abstract financial environment. The mansion economy faded quietly, leaving behind structures that outlived their purpose. There's insight here, not nostalgia. Understanding fragility reveals more than celebrating endurance. The disappearance of the mansion economy does not mean that wealth has become more comfortable. It means that wealth has found new places to go. Modern capital exists inside systems that are faster, deeper, and more abstract than anything available to the families who built great estates. Financial markets can now absorb immense scale without immediate collapse. Legal structures allow ownership to be fragmented, shielded, and reassembled across jurisdictions. Risk can be distributed, hedged, and delayed rather than simply endured. Under these conditions, the problem that once pushed money into land has largely dissolved. Today, money rarely runs out of containers. When one channel becomes inefficient or exposed, others are immediately available. Capital can move between asset classes, geographies, and instruments with minimal friction. Liquidity, once feared, is now actively cultivated. The ability to reposition wealth quickly is treated as a form of security rather than a vulnerability. Where old wealth sought to slow money down, modern wealth seeks to keep it light. This shift explains why contemporary fortunes do not express themselves through self-contained estates. Large properties still exist, but they no longer function as economic centers. They do not coordinate production systems or stabilize cash flow. They do not absorb surplus capital at scale. They are peripheral to wealth, not central to it. The mansion has become optional because the systems that once made it necessary have been replaced. The deeper implication is that wealth is always shaped by institutional capacity. When financial systems are weak, wealth seeks solidity. When legal frameworks are uncertain, wealth becomes territorial. When markets mature, wealth becomes abstract. Again, none of these forms are permanent. They are adaptive responses to pressure. The mansion economy was one such response, perfectly suited to its moment and quietly obsolete once that moment passed. This perspective also complicates how we think about modern inequality. The absence of grand estates does not signal a reduction in concentrated wealth. It signals a reduction in its visibility. Wealth has moved from physical structures into layered systems that are harder to see, harder to tax, and harder to challenge. Where land once anchored power, now abstraction does. The spectacle has faded, but the influence remains. The lesson is not that the past was more stable or the present more fragile. It is that every wealth system carries assumptions that feel permanent until they're no longer supported. The mansion economy endured because it answered a real constraint. Modern financial structures will endure only as long as they do the same. When conditions shift, wealth will migrate again. Seen clearly, the great mansions of history are not symbols of excess, but evidence of adaptation. They show how rational decisions can appear irrational once their context disappears. They remind us that money is never static. It is always looking for a system that can hold it. Understanding this reframes the story of wealth from one of display to one of necessity. It invites us to see capital not as something that chooses freely, but as something that moves under pressure.